everyone. Welcome back. Let's cover our plant topic. So, evolution and diversity of the plant kingdom. Technical definition here. What is a plant? Multicellular eukaryote that carries out photosynthesis and has a set of adaptations for living on land. So you need all components of that definition to be able to define a plant. The fact that they are able to photosynthesize sets them apart from other multicellular eukaryotes that live on land, like animals and fungi. And the last part of the definition, the set of adaptations for living on land, is what distinguishes a plant from an algae or that multicellular protist that we learned about last time. We'll take a look at what those adaptations are and how they make plants plants. And one more distinguishing characteristic, if you are filling out that organismal diversity chart that I posted a few weeks ago, plants do have cell walls, and the cell walls are made of cellulose, which is a type of complex carbohydrate. Fungi also had cell walls, but their cell walls are made out of chitin. And if you recall, bacteria had cell walls as well, but it was made out of a different type of complex carb that we called peptidoglycan. So again, if you are filling out that chart, which I encourage you to do, you should start to be able to compare and contrast the features of these different organisms. So what things have cell walls and what don't, and if it does have a cell wall, what is it made out of? So here are the set of adaptations for living on land, and this is really what distinguishes the plant kingdom, or kingdom plantae, from our multicellular algae or the seaweed, since they are extremely similar but distinct enough to be entirely different kingdoms. So if we look here at the anatomy of a plant, we can see that there are specialized reproductive structures that contain spores and gametes. And again, a spore is a haploid vegetative cell. A gamete, as we've seen throughout the semester, is a sex cell, so egg or sperm. We have specialized organs for photosynthesis called leaves. We have a waxy coating that encapsulates the plant body that prevents water loss called a cuticle. Tiny openings on the underside of most leaves called stomata, which allow carbon dioxide to flow in and oxygen to flow out, so the products and the inputs and outputs of photosynthesis. We see another type of organ in this plant called a stem, and then a third type of organ called roots. And now if we were to contrast the algae with that, we see no specialized organs, but the entire body that we call a thallus performs photosynthesis, absorbs water, does the gas exchange. And another key feature is that algae are aquatic, meaning they are submerged in water, so they do not have to support the weight of their bodies upright like plants do. So that's why these specialized support organs are found in plants only. So we can see some definite differences here between plants and algae based on the fact that plants are able to colonize land while algae are not. So again, just to recap, the definition of a plant did include features the living on land, and here those are broken down for you again. And one thing I didn't mention on the previous slide is that associated with the plant roots is a type of glomeromycota fungi that we learned about in the fungi lecture. And that marriage relationship of fungi and plant root we called mycorrhizae. Now we've seen this term for a couple of weeks out now, so definitely know what it is and know the relationship, what is getting what from the relationship. So again, the plant roots get broken down minerals and nutrients that the fungi have decomposed from the soil. And in turn, the plant will feed the fungi sugar that it made from photosynthesis. So we can see it is a mutualistic relationship. Both organisms benefit. Mycorrhizae. In a closer look at the photosynthetic organ, or we call them leaves on most plants, here is a close-up of those stomata. And stomata is Greek for tiny mouths. So you can see they do look like tiny little mouths that open and close throughout different times of the day so that gas exchange can occur. So CO2 from the air can go in and be incorporated to make sugar, and water and oxygen are allowed to escape. Now, the oxygen, if you recall, was a byproduct of photosynthesis, and the water is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So keep in mind that plants perform both of those energy conversions. So they build up their food molecules and they break it back down. We can also see here that there is a waxy coating on the surface that we call a cuticle. And again, this just helps to keep moisture in so that the plant doesn't dry out. And we can see in some plants, and we'll look at which plants have this feature, we have vascular tissue. So just like humans, we also have vascular tissue in our veins and our arteries that move around blood and oxygen and nutrients, etc. This tissue does the same for the plant. It will move around water, minerals, sugars, salts, whatever the plant needs throughout the plant body. And that also helps to provide good structure for some of the plant phyla that we'll look at in a minute. Here's a really nice picture of that mycorrhizae, which is that relationship between plant roots and fungi. And remember, for this relationship, know what it is and know what both organisms bring to the table. Reproduction. We are at the point in the semester where we can start to zoom in on the specifics of the organisms that we're learning about. So again, we're going to contrast the closest organism to plants that are not plants, which was the multicellular photosynthetic algae that we call seaweed. So in algae, the surrounding water ensures that gametes don't dry out, and it also acts as its dispersal mechanism. So along that algae thallus, or the body of the algae, egg and sperm are made in different little areas, and then when they're mature, they'll just sort of spew out into the water and hopefully match up later. But if you are a land plant, you don't have that luxury. So again, that's why those specialized reproductive structures were developed. So the challenge of living on land as opposed to living in the water: one, you have to keep your egg and sperm from drying out, and two, you have to hope that they meet up somehow. So you have to have a mechanism of dispersal. And because plants have met that challenge through specialized reproductive structures, we can call plants embryophytes, meaning that plants retain the embryo, or the tiny little baby plant, inside maternal tissue for it to grow and develop, much the same that humans do. So the fertilized egg of a plant, or we can call that a zygote or a little baby, remains inside the mother until it develops into a more mature form that we would call a seed in some of the plants. So this meets the challenge of living on land. It protects the embryo from drying out, and mechanisms in other plant groups allow the sperm to travel in the water, air, or through animals. So again, we'll take a look at the specific structures for each of the plant phyla, but how plants reproduce is how they meet that challenge of living on land. So the most important challenge is being able to reproduce yourself, and the specialized structures that plants have meet the challenges of living on land. And they differ for each of the 4 plant phyla, so we'll look at that a little bit closer. So if we take a look inside of the reproductive structure of one of the plant phyla called the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, we can indeed see that nestled within the female part of this flower, we have our little embryo, or our little baby plant. So again, the fact that land plants retain the embryo within maternal tissue makes them embryophytes. So definitely be aware of what that term is, and that land plants do this. So in order to understand the life cycle of land plants, we need to learn some new terms. The plant life cycle we can call alternation of generations. And again, that's just a fancy biology term for the plant life cycle. But if you break that term down, it just describes what's going on. So alternate is going back and forth between generations. Or if you remember back when we did inheritance, a generation was either diploid or haploid, or 2 copies of each chromosome or 1 copy. And our 4 plant phyla will differ in the amount of time that they spend in each generation. But if we were to just look at an example of this, like this chart right here, gametophyte tissue, and again, this is just a new term you're going to have to memorize, is unique to plants. Gametophyte tissue means it is haploid multicellular tissue, and that's pretty strange because, like, for us, an example, we don't have multicellular haploid tissue. The only haploid cells we have are egg and sperm, but plants do it a little bit differently. So we have haploid tissue in the beige part of our diagram, and then we have something called sporophyte, which is multicellular diploid tissue. So basically, within a plant's life cycle, it will alternate between being gametophyte and sporophyte. Gametophyte and sporophyte. So that's the alternation of generations that we're talking about there. So if we start with gametophyte tissue, so multicellular haploid tissue, gametophyte will eventually make gametes. That's easy enough. It's actually in the name itself. And of course, our gametes are the egg and sperm. They will fuse, or the process of fertilization will give us a zygote. And then, of course, since gametes are haploid, so 1 copy of each chromosome, upon fertilization, 1 + 1 is 2. So now our zygote, as we can see, crosses into diploid generation, or that just means that there's 2 copies of each chromosome. So we have a diploid zygote now. We'll undergo mitosis to give us our multicellular diploid tissue, or we call that sporophyte. Sporophyte tissue will undergo meiosis to make spores. And we can see spores are now haploid. And if you recall chapter 8, I believe it was, meiosis will cut the number of chromosomes in half, and that is how we go from 2 to 1. Spores will undergo mitosis to give us gametophyte tissue, and on and on and on. One little trick for these tissue types, the type of cells that they make are in the name. So gametophyte makes gametes, sporophytes make spores. In this life cycle, it's complicated because it's so different from our own life cycle. Definitely study it, understand what all these different types of tissue and these cells do, what they make, because it's going to come in handy later when we look at how this alternation of generations differs within each plant phyla. So now let's go through the 4 plant phyla, and we're going to look at their life cycles, and we're going to compare how they alternate their generations, and all 4 of them are a little bit different in how they do this. So we'll start with the most primitive land plants. We call them bryophytes, or phylum Bryophyta. These plants do not have seeds and they do not have vascular tissue. So these are sort of the outliers of the plant kingdom because they are so different from all other land plants, but because they fit that definition we looked at earlier, so they're multicellular, they photosynthesize, they're eukaryotes, and they have that set of adaptations for living on land, they are, by definition, land plants. So the bryophyte phyla are things like mosses and liverworts and hornworts. These are plants that sprawl low and cover vast areas of land. So they do have adaptations for living on land. So they have a cuticle and they also are embryophytes, but that's about it. They don't have vascular tissue to transport water. That's why they're so small. Like if you look at moss, it doesn't grow very big. And they're also tied to the water. So you will find moss and liverworts and hornworts in wet areas for the most part because they require water to reproduce. So their sperm have to swim through water to find a neighboring egg. Because this is why, again, they inhabit primarily moist areas. These are the only plant group that is gametophyte dominant, meaning they spend most of their lives haploid. So if you refer back to that life cycle chart we just looked at, all of the green parts of moss that you see is gametophyte tissue, meaning it's all haploid. And then when they get ready to reproduce, they will form their diploid tissue called that sporophyte. Now again, this is the only type of plant that lives most of its life haploid. We will see with the other three plant groups that this trend is reversed. So this is also something that makes the bryophytes outliers because they pretty much do everything opposite than any other land plant. And here we see the life cycle of a bryophyte. Now you do not have to memorize any of these specific charts. I just want you to know that basic chart that we went over a few slides ago. I'm just showing this to you to show you what it means that they are gametophyte dominant. So the first way we can tell is the color coding. So the haploid generation is in green, and we can see that green takes up most of this chart here. So that means that this plant spends most of its life haploid. So we can see here we have a gametophyte spore, a male and female gametophyte spore will vegetate into this haploid tissue that, again, because it's multicellular, it's called gametophyte. The gametophyte makes gametes, so sperm and egg, and then sperm and egg will fuse, and we call that fertilization. Okay, and now is when we enter our diploid generation, or then again we call that sporophyte once it becomes multicellular. But again, for the bryophytes, that sporophyte tissue is short-lived, and it's that gametophyte tissue that is dominant. And this is the only land plant group that lives this way. All the others are reversed, so they spend most of their life sporophyte dominant. Again, you don't need to be able to fill this chart out or know specifics. I'm just showing you how and why bryophytes are gametophyte dominant. That just means they spend most of their life haploid. Our second plant group, the pterophytes, the P is silent, so we call them the pterophytes. These are seedless vascular plants, so still no seeds, but now we have vascular tissue. So these are plants like horsetails and ferns. Again, this is just showing you the life cycle here. You do not need to know the 4 plant phyla life cycles themselves. I just want you to know that general one that we worked on a few slides ago. So pterophytes, okay, the adaptations they have for land, they have a cuticle, they're embryophytes, of course, and now we also have vascular tissue. So we're adding on adaptations as we move through the plant phyla. Because our pterophytes have vascular tissue, they can grow taller and also move farther inland. So if you were to look at a fern next to a moss, a fern is going to be much bigger because it's able to support its weight now with the vascular tissue, And you can find ferns in drier places than you would find moss because, again, that vascular tissue can form roots underground and search for water and store water, things like that. But you're not going to find ferns in super dry areas, so they're still tied to moist areas because, again, that's how they reproduce. So the pterophyte sperm, just like the bryophytes, must swim through water to find an egg to fertilize. And now we can see that our generations are starting to shift from the bryophytes. We are no longer gametophyte dominant, but from here on out, all of our other land plant groups are going to be sporophyte dominant, meaning they spend most of their life diploid now, and very, very short-lived gametophyte generation. All right, third plant group we call the gymnosperms. Now this is a collection of various plant phyla. So we have Coniferophyta, for example, Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta. Gymnosperms is just a collection of all of the plants that are naked seed plants. So we have seeds now. So these are vascular plants that produce seeds in cones. So think of a pine cone, and that is a gymnosperm. So compared to our pterophytes that we learned about earlier, gymnosperms have even more adaptations to live on land. So we see a highly reduced gametophyte now. So the gametophyte is now reduced to just a couple of cells at this point. All right, so I'm gonna try to circle those here. The new update on these Macs doesn't allow me to draw very easily on PowerPoint, but vastly reduced gametophyte, highly developed sporophyte. So 99% of the plant's body in its life is now going to be sporophyte generation. We have a wholly dependent gametophyte at this point. We also have something new called pollen. And pollen is a package of plant sperm, basically. And for the gymnosperms, they need wind for fertilization. So the bryophytes and the pterophytes used water, so their sperm had to swim to find an egg. But the gymnosperm are wind pollinated, which is why a lot of these plants are so tall, so that they can produce cones up at the top, so that hopefully the wind will blow through and blow that pollen out of a male cone, and hopefully that pollen will land on a female cone. Along with pollen, we have a new feature called seeds. And a seed is a baby plant in a package with some food and a protective coat. So a lot of new adaptations for our gymnosperm plants. Of course, they can move much further inland because they're not dependent on water for their reproduction. And they're important to humans because we can use them for timber and paper products oftentimes. And so if we look at the anatomy of pollen, we can see it's basically just a little packet of sperm, or we can see that here in the type of nuclei. It's a type of male gametophyte. And if we look at the anatomy of a seed, we can indeed tell that it's a tiny little baby plant or an embryo surrounded by a protective coating and some food. So again, not all plants have seeds, but the last two plant groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, do have seeds. Now we're still embryophytes, meaning the seeds are still protected within the mother tissue for a time, but our seeds can now disperse our embryos much earlier and farther than before as well. So this is just another finesse of reproduction that our last two plant groups have that the first two did not. And then we come to our final plant group, probably the most specialized in terms of reproduction. These are masters at reproducing, the angiosperms. And these are any plant that has a flower. And flowers may not look like typical flowers that you may think. So I'm circling here the flower of a grass plant, and that is a true flower. So angiosperms are the most adapted to land. They have vascular tissue, they produce seeds, and they have a new feature called a fruit. And so now if we were to compare the life cycle of an angiosperm, now again, you don't need to have these specific life cycles memorized. I'm just showing you how we have changed from gametophyte dominant in the bryophytes to now sporophyte dominant in our later land plant groups. The angiosperms are the most successful plant phyla. So almost every land plant is a type of angiosperm. So 90% of the plant kingdom. So sporophyte dominant with a highly reduced gametophyte. Again, just like in our gymnosperms, our gametophyte is only a few cells at this point. Highly refined vascular tissue. They're the most successful land plants. And we have one other super important feature, the master of reproduction structure called a flower. And the flower is just the reproductive structure of any angiosperm, just like a cone is the reproductive structure of a gymnosperm. And flowers are what enabled this plant group to be so successful, because flowers can be wind pollinated, animal pollinated, and they really have developed this master of architecture in terms of reproduction in the flower. And a new feature in our angiosperm group, is a fruit. And a fruit is the ripened ovary of a flower. So you will only find fruits in angiosperms. And of course, the angiosperm group of plants is probably the most important to humans because they provide all of our food, medicines, etc. So here is the anatomy of a perfect flower. And a perfect flower is a hermaphrodite, meaning it has male and female parts on it. So make sure you are able to label a perfect flower like this. So here we can see the male component, and we call that stamen with anther and filament. And anther is where the pollen is made. And then we can see the female component, which is this big structure in the middle. It's called a pistil, made up of a stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. A stigma is where the pollen will land. The pollen will burrow down the style, reach an ovary, and fertilize an ovule. And an ovule is the same term for an egg. And once that fertilization happens in an angiosperm, the ovary will ripen into a fruit. Sorry, I have a little helper with me today. So again, in addition to food, angiosperms have become some of our most important medicines, flavorings, seasonings as well.